Welcome to Into Africa. My name is Judd Devermont. I am the director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I was the National Intelligence Officer for Africa and worked at the National Security Council. This is a podcast where we talk politics and challenge paradigms. On deck today, Africa's security services are using excessive force to ensure compliance with COVID-19 public health measures. Does this portend more abuses and unrest in the coming weeks? And Lesotho's Prime Minister Tom Thabane agrees to step down because of his alleged involvement in his ex-wife's murder. What does his final days in power reveal about politics during this pandemic? Plus, we discuss the trends shaping Africa's future. What types of policies could unleash the continent's potential and stave off the more pessimistic scenarios? So whether you have a history with the continent or you're a newcomer, we want to get you into Africa. As part of the COVID-19 response, Africa's military and police are enforcing stay-at-home orders and lockdowns across the continent. Unfortunately, these measures have led to some deaths and scores of abuses in several countries.
Nigeria's National Human Rights Commission on Wednesday claimed in a report that security operatives killed 18 civilians during enforcement of a total lockdown in major cities in the country over the novel coronavirus.
How do African countries ensure compliance with social distancing measures without relying on excessive force? Joining me to discuss the role of security forces in the COVID-19 response and other issues is Jonathan Rosenthal, the Economist's Africa editor, Erin Sikorsky, the Deputy Director of the Strategic Futures Group at the National Intelligence Council, and Jakkie Cilliers, the Chairman of the Institute of Security Studies, ISS, Board of Trustees, and the head of the African Futures and Innovation team in Pretoria. Jakkie is also the author of the new book, African First, Igniting a Growth Revolution. Just a reminder to our listeners, we're recording this episode remotely for health and safety reasons. We apologize in advance for the sound quality. Also, news is moving really fast these days, so by the time you listen to this, there may have been some updates. Jonathan, let's start with you. The Economist covered this issue in the April 4th edition. Where do we see this happening, and should we be worried about more of these abuses in the future?
Yeah, so we're seeing this, at various levels almost across the continent. It's happening to a much greater extent in countries where there is somewhat weaker rule of law. I think the numbers are all over the show in terms of how many people have died from the virus and how many people have been killed by the security services. But it's certainly fair to say that if, in the early stages of this outbreak, more people were killed by the police and army in enforcing lockdowns than were being killed by the virus itself. And I think this happens, I guess, at two levels. And the one is just a kind of breakdown in the rule of law, and that is simply that policemen and officials are zealously trying to enforce rules and guidelines and overstepping their legal powers. And I think the second worrying thing is that this is just giving a license to police and soldiers in places where there is already very weak rule of law to extort and extract bribes. In reports coming out of Nigeria of people trying to go to the banks or ATMs, which are supposed to be open to get money to feed their families, and being shot at by policemen in support of this lockdown.
So, Jakkie, this isn't a new problem, right? Like, we've seen security abuses in the past. They've been well documented. But I guess, for me, the stakes are higher here. If publics don't trust their governments and they fear the soldiers and the police, it can undercut the fight against the pandemic. Are there ways that governments can prevent this from happening so we can kind of move on to the epidemiological fight and not the issue about sort of public safety?
Yes, security force abuse is huge in Africa, and there are many reasons for this. Poorly trained forces, poorly resourced, is the legacy of abuse. They operate in a semi-democratic or undemocratic settings, and generally there's limited or no oversight from elected authorities and so on. So research that the ISS has done in East Africa and the Sahel has indicated that security force abuse is often the tipping point that turns unhappy, poor, frustrated people into terrorists. And it's not ideology or religion, but it is very often a personal experience from security force abuse. So what to do? I think on the one side, the weaknesses of our security agencies reflect the weaknesses of African states. And this is very important, I think, to underline. So generally, improvements follow improvements in the capacity of the state. But So you don't expect super accountable security agencies in a country such as Lesotho or Zimbabwe or Angola. So improvements follow the general improvements in the capacity of the state. And the basic things to have done is common, remove the secrecy, publish budgets, subject the security forces to a degree of accountability by shining the light of transparency on them and establish clear mechanisms for review and oversight, such as through Parliament or Congress, and professionalize them, better training, management and resourcing. And then, of course, a big problem in much of Africa is that our security agencies are not appropriately structured for the actual roles and functions that they are supposed to play. Our security architecture is just a hangover from the colonial times. We follow the Western model, which is not very well suited to Africa's realities. I mean, you have a country next door to us, I'm in South Africa, Botswana, that buys the most modern fighter aircraft to defend itself against what? You can make the same argument about South Africa. Now, all of this needs to be changed.
I've been thinking through as the pandemic has spread, what are the ways in which things may change for the better. But one thing that I want to point out here that I don't want to ring too much of an optimistic tone, but I've been impressed by a couple of governments admitting that there have been abuses, calling out for the ombudsman, and trying to think about accountability in new ways. And I would just highlight South Africa, which has been decent, although there's been a little bit of problems between what Ramaphosa is saying and what others are saying. President Kenyatta of Kenya apologized. He's done it twice now. In both Botswana and Cote d'Ivoire, we've seen the heads of state talk about accountability and to call out abuses, which you didn't usually see, in part because the victims were marginalized populations, and now it's the general population. But Erin, if we don't see governments really get this under wraps, what are the potential implications if we continue to see this approach towards enforcing the quarantine measures?
Yeah, thanks, Judd. I think as we look at how the pandemic's going to shape things on the continent in the months and years to come, we have to think, what trends does the pandemic confirm and which does it break? So you need to look at what was happening before the pandemic and how the current crisis may be amplifying the trends, or as you and Jakkie and Jonathan have noted, how key actors are exploiting the crisis to take actions towards which they were already predisposed, right? Things they already had on their agenda, ways they may have already planned to act. And as you guys well know, 2019 was the year of protests around the globe, and sub-Saharan Africa had one of the highest protest rates, growth rates over the past 10 years. A lot of these protests have stopped in the midst of the pandemic, but the underlying drivers of those protests still remain. So I think in many cases, the pandemic and government responses are exacerbating these drivers or throwing them into sharper relief. A few things that we're watching from the Strategic Futures Group perspective as we think about global trends in terms of drivers that might contribute to future unrest or political instability. In terms of the pandemic, one is government capacity, which we've already talked about, right? Can they meet the healthcare and economic challenges posed by the pandemic? The second, and this is really important, is public trust. So will the population believe what the government or other institutional authorities are telling them about COVID-19? And then the third is inequality. Do publics perceive the government responses unequal? Do they think one group is being privileged over another? The examples you highlight, Judd, are concerning, particularly the identification of scapegoats and the lack of trust in authorities. Of course, these aren't unique to sub-Saharan Africa, and I would expect if you continue to see the security abuses and lack of trust in what government's telling folks across the continent, we could see protests and unrest pick back up again.
That's a really interesting point, particularly this one about inequality. I've been impressed with just the outburst of anger when a celebrity or a government official in sub-Saharan Africa breaks the quarantine or breaks the self-isolating measures. And at least in South Africa, there was a repercussion for doing that. But I think people are watching to make sure that these laws are being applied equal across sectors and classes. So excellent points. I appreciate that.
Judd, can I jump in there? And sorry to take us back, but I thought your point about this leading to increasing calls for accountability is a really interesting one. And one of the things that my correspondents have been telling me from various countries, whether it's Kenya or Uganda, etc., is that in normal circumstances, given the kind of divisive nature of politics in many countries, whether it's language or tribal ethnicity or whatever it may be. The security forces and the police are often sort of beating one group and kind of getting cheered on by another. And what seems to be idiosyncratic about this is that sort of everyone is feeling put upon by the security forces, and therefore you have a much more kind of cross-cutting demand for accountability.
I think that's right. I think you're seeing governments trying to do whatever they can, palliative or not, to address it. Okay, let's move to Lesotho. I said in the opening that things are moving really fast. Here's a perfect example. I think we're finally moving to an end to the drama around the murder of Prime Minister Thabane's ex-wife. Just to get everyone up to speed, Prime Minister Thabane, who is 80 years old, filed for divorce from his second wife in 2012. 5 years later, she was shot and killed while driving home. That was 2 days before Thabane's inauguration and just 2 months before he remarried his third wife. Now, in February, his current wife, the First Lady, was charged with the murder of the ex-wife, and Thabane was implicated. He said, all right, I'm going to step down by July, I promise, and then quickly started to backpedal, and it looked like he was going to find a way to hold on. And then just a couple of days ago, as of this recording, he agreed to finally step down.
Lesotho's government has agreed with South African mediators and political parties to implement a dignified retirement for Prime Minister Thomas Thabane. This was disclosed in a joint statement on Monday, signaling step-up effort to end the political crisis. Thabane has been under pressure to resign owing to a murder case in which he and his current wife are suspected of being involved in the assassination of his previous wife, charges which both of them deny.
And I think this is a good story to talk about. It's not a good story, but it's a good story to talk about because I think it allows us to take the temperature of Lesotho's democracy. And I'd love to hear, Jakkie, your thoughts about what's happening to the country within your country.
Context is quite important. Lesotho is a low middle income country entirely surrounded by South Africa. Almost 80% of its population live below the $3.20 extreme poverty level for low middle income countries. Most of them live in rural areas. 25% of them are infected with HIV/AIDS. High levels of unemployment, threat of economic collapse, ongoing. So its politics is dominated by personality politics and ego leadership. And Prime Minister Thabane, as you said, and his wife were charged with the murder of his second wife. And he has then tried to first close Parliament and use the COVID-19 epidemic as an excuse to try and hang on to power. And he's tried to fire his chief of police and tried all kinds of ways to try and subvert the democratic process. The fact that he is in actual fact charged in itself is quite amazing. And I think that reflects to the extent to which, even in a country like Lesotho, accountability and the sense of an independent judiciary is taking some hold. So I think that this is all generally good news.
Yeah, I think that it's an example of that in a fragile democracy, we can see leaders try to hold on to power, try to find any pretext possible. But if you do have institutions, as you said, Jakkie, and particularly in this case where you had both the ruling party, Thabane's party, but also the opposition pushing extraordinarily hard to get him to adhere to his commitments and step down. And by the way, a South African mediation that was critical, you can have good outcomes. But Jonathan, I wanted to just tease out something that Thabane said that Jakkie referenced, and that was around COVID. He said, while we are busy with COVID-19, it's shocking to learn that some selfish people are busy plotting to unlawfully overthrow the government. Embarrassingly, some of the people leading the campaign to topple my government are legislators from the party that I am leading. And the question I want you to tackle is, how concerned should we be that other governments may try to use the same playbook to say COVID-19 is an extraordinary circumstance, and so my opposition, the press, etc., should toe the line and allow me to sort of rule without any pushback or complications?
We should be immensely concerned, and the reason we should be so concerned is because it's happening already. It wasn't just Lesotho. We're seeing that happening elsewhere with authoritarian presidents. we have seen elections sort of either postponed, or elections and referendum, or taking place in really difficult circumstances. And I suppose what makes this quite tricky to think about is that in some respects, kind of democracy is damned if it doesn't, damned if it doesn't. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The one was Guinea, which held this constitutional referendum that could in theory allow President Alpha Conde to run for another 2 terms. And that took place in, I suppose, the early stages of this outbreak, but clearly a circumstance in which people may not have been comfortable going out and voting. On the other hand, you've got Ethiopia, which over the past 18 months, 2 years, has been moving towards democracy. The sorts of states of emergency and massive repression that we saw under the previous government has largely been lifted under Abiy Ahmed, and he is trying to move towards a more democratic state. But he doesn't have a democratic mandate. He was put in place by the ruling party, not through a full election. And elections there are scheduled for August, which would really sort of allow him to put his democratic movement to the vote. And that clearly has to be postponed. The question then becomes one of, does that postponement simply buy time for the democratic process to move forward, or does postponing the election by 12 or 18 months, or however long it takes to try to get through this virus, then give them a free hand to sort of unleash the security forces on the opposition?
It's almost like the prescription is the same for this issue as it was for the one about the security sector, is that communication and transparency are imperative. You have to be able to create a consensus around the decisions that you're making. And that's the big distinction I make. I try not to say there's a right or wrong answer to whether you hold an election, delay it, postpone it, cancel it. But the critical thing is that you have institutional support, which Abiy did. You have general support amongst the opposition and the political class. And that's where we're sort of probably not going with the case of Malawi and a couple of other countries where it doesn't seem like there is a consensus forming around how to handle their election. And that's the only way you get through it. It's not an issue of what's the right time, because there's no perfect answer here, but it's that everyone agrees or has general understanding of why you're making the decisions you are.
I would totally second that, in particular in the case of Malawi, where you've had a court ordering a rerun and the government fairly flagrantly ignoring that, having previously been found by the court to have rigged the election.
I want to move on to our last topic, which is something that the four of us have spent a lot of time and experience doing, which is forecasting and scenario analysis. All of my 3 guests have deep experience in this field. Jakkie just published his book, Africa First, Igniting a Growth Revolution. Jonathan wrote the Economist special report, The African Century. Erin is working on the next edition of the National Intelligence Council's Global Trends, which is due in January 2021. So everyone, knows how to do this quite well. And I think this it will be a really interesting conversation about where the continent's going. Jakkie, let's start with your book first. There's a pretty dismal outlook in the beginning about extreme poverty and, what I would call the tyranny of the continent's demographic burden. So what I'd like you to do is walk us through some of your main conclusions and particularly some of the methodology that helped you get there.
The origins really of the book is the growing gap in incomes that has been evident between averages in South Africa and the rest of the world since independence. So what I do in the book is I take a succession of, in actual fact, 11 areas, and I model what would be the impact of an aggressive but reasonable forecast of improvements. And I do that with demographics. Africa only gets to its demographic dividend around mid-century. So our young population is not a boon. It's in actual fact a drag on our development. And then I put this all together in a final chapter where I look at an Africa First scenario, where I put these interventions together and see what is the combined impact. If all good things come together, what could be possible for Africa by 2040? And I compare that with what I refer to as the current path trajectory, which is where Africa is expected to go. It's a culmination of the last 10 years of long-term forecasting that I've done at the Institute.
Reading your book, Jakkie, which is phenomenal, and then reading Jonathan's special series, in many ways, the conclusions are the same, but the way that you get there is different. So, Jakkie, you march us through some pretty tough statistics and then sort of end with some of the potential policy prescriptions that could reach to a better future than the current trajectory. And Jonathan, I don't know if I'm taking liberties here, but I feel like you give us a sandwich, right? You've got a very hopeful note in the beginning and a hopeful note at the end, but then in the middle, I think you get more of the challenges and the real struggles that the continent will have to sort of emerge from its demographic drag, as Jakkie says. So I'd love to hear how you have been thinking about the Africa century and the region's prospects for growth and influence globally.
Yeah. So I guess the first thing when I think about the African century is just to think about the fact that this is a continent that, for both good and perhaps ill, will play a very much larger role in world affairs. So if you go back to the colonial period, the population of Africa was sort of 1/3 the size of Europe's. Whereas now it's considerably larger. And if you look at the demographic projections, and if you take the median United Nations population division projection by the end of the century, by 2100, just under 40% of the world's population is forecast to be in Africa. So just by dint of that, if you have that many people, you kind of can't ignore the continent. I guess where I then differ and perhaps would disagree slightly with Jakkie is that I think that demographic forecast is badly underestimating the impact of education, of girls' education, because what you see, both in Africa and around the world, is that by and large, a woman who has not been educated at all will have 6 to 7 children. A woman who had some primary school education will probably have about two children fewer. And once she's finished secondary school, on average, she'll be having sort of 2 or fewer children. So I'm quite optimistic that the big investments we've had in education over the past 15, 20 years are likely to lead to a considerable drop in what they call the fertility ratio, the number of children that women are going to have. And I think that
I don't agree.
Jakkie, why don't you agree?
We factor in, of course, fertility rates differ quite significantly, and we factor in the impact of female education, greater distribution of modern contraceptives, basically female empowerment in our forecast. But our fertility forecast, when we use Fs, is slightly below the median. Now, looking out with modern technology out towards the end of the century, I do that as well, is the margin for error really grows. But I think we can, with a degree of confidence, look out till 2040, about 2050. And the reality is that, for example, median education levels, whether you're looking at adult above 15 or adult above 25, the gap between that in the rest of the world and Africa has not changed in 40 years. And the problem is not only the quantity of education, but the quality of education in Africa is in actual fact falling further behind. So even if you get a revolution in education, and that translates because what is really the driving force behind reductions in fertility rates is upper secondary female education. Education helps, but in actual fact, what is a much more powerful driver of reductions in fertility is rolling out modern contraceptives. So education is important, but it will not be enough. What Africa has to do beyond political leadership, which is absolutely critical, is that it needs to roll out modern contraceptive if it wants to more rapidly get to its demographic dividend.
I am going to agree with Jakkie in part, and I think where I'm going to agree is that forecasting is inherently dangerous, and arguing about demographics when neither of us is a professor of demographics is probably even more dangerous. I'm going to agree with you that contraception and availability does play a role, but I'm going to just throw out two last points. One is that if one looks at Iran, where there was a sort of strong post-revolutionary Iran, so after 1980, when you had the mullahs in power, and they were strongly pro-natal. They believed that it was serving God to have many babies, and they encouraged this. But at the same time, they also believed in educating girls, and you had this huge jump in female literacy and schooling rates, and the fastest demographic transition we've seen anywhere in the world. Between the 1980s and the mid 2000s, you saw people going from about 6 babies per woman to less than 2. So these transitions can be really rapid when they do happen. And the second is clearly, contraception helps. But if one goes somewhat further back in history and looks at a place like Norway, which had its demographic transition, 120 years ago, there wasn't much modern contraception. But, the change that happens is not necessarily that you are educating people to a particularly high standard. What you are doing is you're saying, you have control over your own fertility and life.
Jakkie, we're going to do three things here. First, we're going to say people should read both your book and Jonathan's series. And then The Economist featured your comment that you had in the subsequent issue, so you can read that. Two, I think that we will definitely have to come back to this issue in another podcast or an event because it is critically important. And three, we're going to bring Erin into the conversation, both if she has any reactions to this debate, but also because in the last version of Global Trends, you did talk about some of these issues, right? The Nick said, in the next 5 years, sub-Saharan Africa will become more populous, youthful, urban, mobile, educated, and network. I didn't write those words. I did sign off on them. Erin, reactions to the conversation that Jakkie and Jonathan are having? And then are there things that you're able to preview that you may say about the continent in the next edition? I think it's going to be due just before the U.S. inauguration, right? In January 2021?
Yep, absolutely. So just a little background on Global Trends. It's published every 4 years by the National Intelligence Council. It looks out 5 and 20 years at key trends and uncertainties shaping U.S. national security. And it is, like you mentioned, tied to the U.S. election cycle. So it's meant to inform a new or returning presidential administration as they shape their national security strategy. Before commenting on where we're going, just to comment on the conversation between Jonathan and Jakkie. Absolutely, we also have identified demographics as a key structural driver, right, that will shape the globe over the next 20 years. And that's been a trend in all the previous reports. It's one of the easiest trends in some ways to predict going forward. Where the uncertainty lies, and I think this is where the debate and the conversation happens, is what are the policy responses? How do humans react to this structural driver, right? How do states, how do individuals, how do institutions respond and decide to interact with or try and change that driver? And that's where these questions about fertility rates and interventions and how do you shift that? And I think those are the kind of places we like to highlight in Global Trends. But to go back to your question about what we said in 2017, most of that analysis obviously still holds. For the next report, though, I would add some words to that list. Mainly, I would add that the intensifying effects of climate change and environmental degradation are going to be a key challenge across the continent during the time period covered by the next report. We expect climate change is going to exacerbate a lot of the challenges we've already talked about, including food and water security, demographic and migration pressures, and conflict dynamics. I'd also highlight, though, I think it presents an opportunity for innovative responses. I'll be watching in particular local dynamics at the city and sub-state level to see if we can identify some successful governance adaptations. But I don't want to underplay the extreme challenge it's going to pose. And I think governments, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but around the globe, are going to face real difficulties as they try and balance short-term political considerations with the long-term climate considerations. I also think for Africa, one thing that the climate challenge underscores is the interconnectedness issue. And really, carbon emissions aren't a problem, obviously, of sub-Saharan Africa's making, but the continent's going to feel the effects more acutely and more quickly than a lot of the rest of the globe. Two other trends I would preview, and these have already been talked about a bit by Jonathan and Jakkie, but one is Africa's growing influence on the world. In many ways, it's just a numbers game, given the growing population, but I expect that African soft power is going to grow around the globe, as well as its economic power, both as a market, but also, I think, potentially in terms of innovation. And then a corollary to that point is the increasing role of external actors in sub-Saharan Africa. I think another change will be the response from African governments and societies will shape the trajectory of this involvement a lot more over the next 20 years. And so I think we'll see, leaders and governments not just being passive recipients, but actively shaping how external actors play. And there's a lot of uncertainty here about how that will play out. Will it be a collaborative response across the continent? Will it be more competitive? How will African countries interact?
That's great, Erin. That sounds like it's going to be a fantastic contribution to the way we think about the continent. And I want to hone in on something you said about adaptation and policy choices. And I think this is Really, Jakkie, I think this is the strength of your book for me, and it's about policy interventions, or as Erin said, adaptions, right? There are policy interventions that the continent's leaders can take and civil society around education or agriculture, industry, trade, etc., that can unleash the continent's potential. And I'd love it if you could just share maybe one or two that you think are really important that need to be sort of enacted now to improve African lives.
Thanks, Judd. Yes, the modeling that I've done would indicate that across low, middle, and upper middle income countries, the initiatives that could have the biggest potential impact on Africa's future economic prosperity is the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, firstly, and secondly, then, of course, on governance. On the first, I think the argument, in a sense, is quite basic, and that is that different to the US, Europe, China, and India, Africa simply doesn't have large enough markets. It needs regional trade integration if it is going to have economies of scale. The second, of course, is governance, and that is not necessarily the same as democracy. But what Africa needs is developmentally orientated governing elites. And at low levels of development, as we generally know, democracy doesn't really make much of it makes no contribution to growth. The third that, of course, has a big impact is the issue of leapfrogging. Africa, because it comes off such a low base, has significant potential to use the digital economy, to use the fourth industrial revolution, the shifts that we see in global value chains, to in actual fact benefit from this greater trend of regionalization of manufacturing, of building regional value chains as opposed to necessarily global value chains. And these are the key interventions, depending, of course, and I differentiate generally in the book between low, middle, and upper middle income countries as a useful way to get a grip on, a continent of 55 very, very diverse countries. So those are some of the key takeaways. But I think the other general one is simply that Africa needs to invest in getting the basics right. You develop by investing in literacy, in basic primary and then secondary education, by making sure that there are roads and infrastructure and water and sanitation. And the reality is that that does not happen. And I think that Erin's interesting visions of where Africa's agency is going to go, our forecasts do not reflect that. I'm afraid that the forecast that I've done, Africa's 3.5% of the global economy. By 2040, on the current path, it's 4% of the global economy. Yes, its population increases dramatically, but because its economy is not growing, power is shifting towards Asia, not towards China, towards Asia. And Africa's political orientation will inevitably follow that shift over time. So it's going to be an interesting debate to have.
Well, we probably won't be able to resolve the debate in the few minutes remaining. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to ask Jonathan and Erin if there are any silver bullets or non-silver bullets that you want to add to the conversation in terms of key trends to watch or key policy interventions that would really make a difference. So why don't we start with Jonathan?
I think we just have to be very clear that when we're talking about Africa, and as people have noted before, we're talking about a diverse continent with many different countries. If one looks at that diversity, one can also then sort of draw some quite interesting lessons, because we have had a series of almost natural experiments across the continent. Of, if one looks at Mauritius and Madagascar, two sort of island states that start out in a fairly similar place on independence, and one succeeds enormously and the other doesn't. And a lot of that is about inclusive government, as has been mentioned. It's about education. Again, if one looks at otherwise similar states like Rwanda and Burundi, and although neither are democratic, the one is doing much better in terms of development. It's about having a state that is basically competent versus a state that is highly extractive and corrupt. And I guess this then brings us to the final 2 points, which is, overwhelmingly, Africa's future is in the hands of Africa and Africans, and we often talk about it as if the people in the continent have no agency, and we need to recognize that this is their future and they will shape it. Part of what we're doing is we're engaging in a battle of ideas. It's not simply about sort of providing money to build schools or pay social welfare grants. It's actually about saying this is a set of ideas, whether it's governance, democracy, education, etc., markets, that have been shown to work elsewhere, but actually sort of putting our money behind those, and I also would argue putting our money behind the sort of civil society and NGOs that are trying to push more transparency, more inclusive governance.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think those are great points. I'm going to ask Erin for the final word. I'm not going to ask Erin to provide any policy recommendations, but if there's any trends or context that you want to end our podcast on.
Sure. Thanks, Judd. And I agree with a lot of the excellent points made by Jakkie and Jonathan. I guess the point I would end on right now is going back to what we started the conversation about, this moment we're in with the pandemic and the global economic crisis. And I think we have to recognize that this is one of the most uncertain moments we've been in over the past 5 to 10 years. And so projecting into the future, we have to be very humble about the uncertainty that we're in and questions about where trajectories might go. And some of the questions I would highlight, one is, if we have this global economic recession or depression, what does that mean for growth in sub-Saharan Africa? If we see a sustained closing off by most countries around the world in response to the pandemic, also, what does that mean? There's that great article in The Economist about remittances going back to the continent and that being in jeopardy. And then the impact, as we were discussing earlier, on governance and regime type. We've already been seeing a retreat in democracy globally, and does the pandemic exacerbate that on the continent as well? So I think those are just questions we're going to have to keep in the back of our mind as we look at our models and we look at our forecasting for the future that we were doing, as of January 2020. A lot of things have changed and a lot of things are very uncertain now. So how do we weave that into our forecast going forward? I think will be an important question over the next year to 18 months.
Those are exactly right. And we will do our best at CSIS and on the podcast to try to tackle those. I'll just leave on an optimistic note. I do think that there's some creative destruction going on, and we need to be thinking about not only how do we weather this particular crisis, but how do we build stronger societies and governments at the other end of the tunnel. Let me just thank all of my guests for joining us today, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. We want to have more conversations about Africa. Tell your friends, subscribe to our podcast at Apple Podcasts or wherever you find good content. You can also check out our analysis and reports at csis.org/Africa. Thanks.